Some of you may never have met her, and I hope you will say hello. And my partner, Len Van Gaspig, of now 15 years. Some of you have met. I think you actually met him at the opera one time. And other lovely people, including the children who made me cry when I saw them, because it has been 20 years. So, a couple of preambles. One of them is, when people die, the only way I can speak about them afterwards is to write them a letter. So this is really a letter to Mary, and that's how I will do it. The other one is, you have to know that during the period that we were closest to Mary, Judy and I were a kind of duo, an inseparable duo, trying to represent this age spectrum of the women's movement at that time. So nothing that I accomplished at that time, or the work that I did with Mary, even some of it, could possibly have been done without Judy, without her energy, her imagination, her determination. So I just want to make that plain. And she was also responsible with Yu Cheng for today, as you know. And she's out there shuffling papers, and that'll always be my memory of Judy, organizing the papers, even in meetings and concerts and everywhere else. Okay, so I'm calling you all the beloved because that's the word that so often appears in obituaries and tombstones. You are the beloved of Mary, and Mary is our beloved. So, dear beloved and dear Mary, I'm going to read some of this in order to save time. 20 years can seem like yesterday, and it can also seem like a very long time ago. For those of us who remember you, Mary, we sustained the powerful imprinting of you and your love in just a few turbulent years, or even just a month at times during the last revolution. That revolution never really quite ended, though the press was eager to pronounce us dead. But the imprinting of those times remains, slumbering underground ever since until just recently and even right now. Dear Mary, today's children would have made you cry, as they did me and others. They might make you hope, as they are doing to so many of us. They could be your children. What endures and feels so present right now is the people who led us during those times, who were listening to their own drummers and offered us, inspired us with those rhythms. This is the best possible moment, better now than even last week, to salute you, Mary, because you were one of the brightest stars of that last revolution, if not the brightest. And so you can help us now to renew our vows to resist. But was there ever such a light-hearted, mischievous, and loving revolutionary leader as you were, Mary? Surrounded by children and a loving husband who was also a physician, confirmed by medical training and practice, as well as the competence of psychology and prodigious scholarship in the humanities, you had demonstrated conclusively, even to those with the deepest prejudices, that the ineradicable fundamental handicap of being a woman, especially in medicine, could be compensated for as much as humanly possible. What could possibly go wrong? I have not seen the notes of meetings that must have taken place within that all-male, virtually all-white, all-upper-class bastion of elite privilege and Boston Brahmin dominance that was academic medicine at Harvard at that time. They even described in mid-20th century writings that medicine had become, perhaps, Western civilization's finest flower. Now, something had to be done, because the women were coming. The women were coming. Somehow they had to be co-opted, whether they wanted them or not, and there was plenty of evidence that the leadership did not want them and never had, and were in no way prepared to receive them. But that leadership was about to be forced to admit women in greater numbers than ever before. Somehow, someone very special would have to be appointed to deal with them. Who could that be? Whatever else, it had to be a woman. And besides, many more women's bathrooms would have to be built in all the marble temples of the quad, and quickly. This item on their agenda actually did come down to us. When you and I did meet Mary in our early 40s on the Longwood campus, we gradually recognized one another as being from a very small group of educated women, the smallest cohort in the 20th century. Of those, only a very small group pursued graduate education, and even fewer of them became feminists. In time, likely we knew them all. We were born in the same year, you and I, and lived our lives as girls and women growing up in this country. At that time on the Longwood campus, I was simply a student at the Harvard School of Public Health, earning my MPH degree. But I had already spent a decade working as a nonprofit volunteer here in Boston, across the country, and in North America with community groups and some global professionals, trying to improve maternity care practices. I didn't particularly want to be at Harvard, and I never aspired even for one moment to become a doctor, as you may recall. And of course, Mary was like no doctor I had ever known. Anyway. But of course, as a married woman with a child, I had to be in Boston. Those at the Harvard School of Public Health surely felt they had things to teach me. But I had also just become a member of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective and helping to prepare the first commercial Simon & Schuster edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. By the time my MPH was awarded in '73, the book was out. It was the year that the Supreme Court handed down the Roe versus Wade decision legalizing abortion. I met you without knowing any of your extraordinary credentials or accomplishments. We began our collaboration in the newly reconstituted Commission on the Status of Women at the Longwood Medical Area campus. And that included the entire campus, all of its schools, and all of its employees, most of whom were women. There we listened to Mary Rowe from MIT tell us what was truly needed and what had already been accomplished at MIT to protect women and empower them. We dreamed it could be a model for what Harvard could do. We had been on very different paths, you and I, using totally opposite tools to be on that campus. Yet by the time we met, we had a number of similar goals and a determined sense of mission. We wanted medicine and all of those in charge of policies on that campus to live up to their own professed ideals and solemn oaths, to be more accountable to those being cared for, more resistant to the easy money and corruption risks of the pharmaceutical industry, to be more scientific in its evaluations, more honest in its messaging and about the harms caused by medical care itself, more ethical in all its behaviors, more transparent and inclusive about how it makes decisions and does its work. And finally, we expected those institutions to be much more responsible to all of society that seemed to us only reasonable in exchange for the enormous, often disproportionate wealth and privilege they enjoyed and the nearly unlimited social power granted to them as healers by the entire society. But not least, with Judy and the collective and many other women in the fledgling women's health movement, you and I both recognize that medicine's power and domination over everyday life, a power that scholars like Herb Zola and Ivan Illich came to call medicalization, was still growing, expanding its already considerable control over women in particular, starting with limiting their numbers in medical education and training, but pervading the entire enterprise. To change this unhealthy situation seemed absolutely essential, and among many other resources to do this work, we needed data, proof of discrimination, and poor management. You began producing a lot of our data and wrote for the women's fledgling newsletters besides. I soon learned that you had planned most of the interviews with women, applicants to medical school, eventually published in the feminist press as Why Would a Girl Go Into Medicine? And that Margaret Campbell, its author, was in fact your pen name. And over time, you published some of the best compilations then available of all the categories of evidence of discrimination against women in health and medical care in the New England Journal of Medicine. A two-part summary published in Pediatrics, challenging and documenting and demolishing once and for all the myths so often pronounced and promoted by pediatricians that children of most working mothers would and did suffer irreparable harm. You produced the evidence that these ideas were false, anchored in your impeccable scholarship, and placed them in medical journals no one could dismiss, even though they tried. I'm going to have some water. I'm sorry.
Whoops, we should have brought that. Oh, you've got it.
How are we doing? Is that 10 minutes?
Keep going. Just keep finishing. I mean, you want to hear every word about Mary.
Well, you'll all be able to read it anyways, eventually. However, this is now quite personal, and I've debated whether I should do this or do something that, thanks, Nick. I'll drink your water instead. Good, thanks. So, Mary, you also believed in my capacity to play a leadership role, or at least that I deserved an apprenticeship or a mentorship. And I had no idea that you were designing such a thing for me. And I came to know it was part of your special genius to continually offer me opportunities that I would never have had otherwise, and I certainly never got from my faculty at the School of Public Health. I came to know that you did this with many other people too, and I suppose if we keep working at it, we're going to learn more about all of the people that Mary mentored and helped in so many ways. As you may recall, you made me spruce up my vita, as they were called in those days, and sent me to be interviewed by Martina Horner at the Radcliffe Institute to become the new director of the Radcliffe Health Program, soon to be. P.S. I did not get the job. I was no way qualified, and the program never happened anyway. But I learned a lot in that process. Still another time, while holding your office as dean and while I was still a student, I believe, you sent me to New Orleans to the convention of the most powerful and prestigious body in the obstetrics and gynecology establishment, the American Board of OBGYNs, knowing by then that I like to eat OBGYNs for breakfast. Your sending me there was one of your most disrespectful acts. It is difficult to think of a more outrageous no-no than a non-physician misrepresenting a physician. It is even a crime under some circumstances. But you sent me as a substitute for you, a dean of women and minority students at the Harvard Medical School, to take the platform and speak, participating in their meeting as if I was one of them. I knew from the expressions of some of their faces that they were appalled, but mostly I remember thinking that they would make certain nothing so outrageous would ever happen to them again. But perhaps that was not quite the capstone of my career as an impersonator Mary that only you could make possible. It was my initiation through your largesse into the inner circles, or the belly of the beast, as we called it at that time, of that part of the medical establishment I was keeping most constantly under my non-medical gaze. You had a friend in Chicago, a physician and psychiatrist named Ann Seiden, who had published a really interesting article whose thesis was childbirth as mastery. I really liked it. She'd been invited to meet with some of the leadership circle of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology for dinner at their headquarters, located in Chicago at that time, very close to the AMA. They all moved to Washington eventually, as you know, but at that time, Chicago was the place. You proposed that I go in your place, and Anne graciously agreed. I do not recall now whether my substitute presence came as a surprise to them. I can't tell you what we said at dinner or what we ate in a glorious pink silk dining room fit for an upper-class bordello, all hung with genuine impressionist paintings, possibly rented for the occasion. I know I came away with a much deeper understanding of the level of power and influence arrayed against all of us, hardly diminished even to this day. One more of your amazing gifts to me, Mary, a part of my education I will never forget. And then, after I had earned my MPH and was already enrolled as a medical sociology grad student at Tufts, Mary, you were still at Harvard Medical School and asked Judy and me, representing the collective, if we would work, and I should say other community groups at the time, if we would work with her students to help organize a conference at Harvard Medical School. Seemed easy enough. As most of you know, the rest is history. That event became the 1975 Conference on Women's Health, and it was, I would say, one of the first occupying movements of that time, because we occupied every single classroom, laboratory, auditorium, and corridor in the entire Longwood Medical Area campus, and that included the library and the School of Public Health. As some of you may remember hearing, we really did freak out the school's administrators when they discovered that as organizers we had achieved what had amounted to an occupation. I was among the gray-haired team of supposedly mature women, some with Longwood Medical Area credentials, who were sent to meet those administrators the night before the conference was set to open. They wanted to cancel it. Our job, which we did, was to calm their fears that there might be vandalism to property or violence to people on campus coming from the almost 3,000 women expected from the United States, Canada, and Mexico the next morning. You helped found the National Women's Health Network, and it was not said, but Phyllis Cheslett was also one of the founders. There were 5 of them, Phyllis was one, with several other women whose work was indispensable in producing the evidence undergirding the exploding activism of the women's health movement. The following year, the second edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves was published, and this one came onto the New York Times bestseller list, also triggering many best-selling foreign editions. We were all beginning to make history, and more often there was a sense of inevitability about what we did and what happened as a result. I recall so vividly the big sprawling houses in which you always lived during all this, in Newton and here in Watertown, filled with children's voices, something always cooking or baking in the big kitchen on one of the biggest ranges I had ever seen. You made nooks and crannies upstairs where people could do truant reading if they wanted or needed to. I remember arriving at York, Maine with the sound of Elton John booming out over the veranda and onto the harbor nearby as you offered me a drink. But you, dear Mary, had long since come to the end of your tolerance for many things, and your hope that the powerful position you occupied would not be distorted or blunted by those secretly and not so secretly opposed to everything you stood for. You were not the first Midwesterner or the first outsider to come to Harvard and slowly see revealed the kind of tribalism and power that did not brook interference by people outside their own inner circles. And I began to move into another realm overseas and could not follow you into your next career in adoption reform. I was going to read you her letter of resignation, which she published as an open letter and went all over the women's movement, but I think there's a copy of it up there, and maybe we'll read it another time. All of the rising triumph of what you accomplished was shot through with both happy and unhappy personal struggles of many kinds, however, and we were determined to see some of them through to resolution, to bear witness. Later, I took you to the York County Courthouse in Maine, where your divorce finally ended. We stood by during the terrible months of the kidnapping. We helped out when colleague Michelle Harrison needed trustworthy babysitting so she could finish her OBGYN residency at Beth Israel, an experience that resulted in her very successful book, A Woman in Residence. Somewhere, I have a picture of you playing your violin, looking very much like my Aunt Peggy, serenading me on my birthday. I'm going to find that picture. And finally, I remember being nearby during some of the hours of your dying and your death, learning that you had refused to be a patient yourself in the system in which and against which you had labored for so long. I made you some promises then that I've not kept to tell your whole story, but maybe it's not too late. So when I ask myself if I can name what it was you stood for really that inspired so many of us and stirred such deep resistance among so many others, I can only stumble and fall back on such trite cliches as moral courage, knowing that says nothing. There is no simple answer to explain how your shining integrity was formed, where your steely determination came from, what forces kept you driving to seek out the least endowed and least privileged among us and care for them so lovingly, or how you did it all with so much grace and kindness and with such exceptional good humor. I suspected then, and I know now, that we will never see your like again. But I hope you know, wherever you transition to, that we are still here, still trying to match your deathless spirit and pass it on.
Oh, thank you so much, Norma. Oh, that was beautiful. I'm so glad we captured that forever. And
Well,
then
it's
more.
much too long, but there you
I'll
are.
say a couple more words, but while I'm speaking, why don't those who are going to play in the high